All right, well, welcome. Thank you for making the time and joining us on this webinar. Today, we will be discussing our new report, Retained Transportation Fuel Spending in the Southeast, Electric versus Internal Combustion Engines. My name is Dory Larson. If you can switch to the next slide. I'm the EV Program Manager with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE. If you're not familiar with us, Electrify the South is a program of SACE that advances our work, leveraging research, advocacy, and outreach with a focus on accelerating the equitable transition to clean energy-powered electric transportation throughout the Southeast. I'm joined today by the authors and SACE colleagues, Heather Ponen, our Energy Policy Manager, Stan Cross, Electric Transportation Policy Director, and Maggie Schober, Director of Utility Reform. A quick few notes about this webinar. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit your questions in the question and answer box located at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. If you are with a publication, please let us know which publication you're with when you're submitting your question, and we'll get to those at the end. Also, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll be sending the recording link to registrants following the webinar. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Stephen Smith, Executive Director of SACE, to kick us off.
Thank you, Dory, and thanks everybody for joining. I guess we'll bring up the next slide. I'm Stephen Smith, Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and we are very excited to share this report. Many of us have been using electric vehicles and supporting electric vehicles and talking about the benefits that come both to the environment and to people's pocketbooks about electric vehicles. Most of that is focused on the savings that comes from moving away from fossil fuels to electric, and also the savings in maintenance through not having to do oil changes and tune-ups and other things like that, just basically windshield wiper blades and tires for maintenance on electric cars primarily. But we wanted to go deeper and really understand what are the implications regionally for going to electrification. And so this report is going to actually dig into that. And there's a couple of key points that you'll hear the authors talking about today. We spend over $94 billion on gas and diesel fuels annually in the Southeast. And the vast majority of that leaves the region. If we were, and as we are, switching to electric transportation, we can actually retain or keep that money in our local economies, a significant portion of it. And that money then will multiply in the local economies. And so what we want to do is put a spotlight on that part of the economic benefits of electrification. We all know that transportation has surpassed the utility sector as far as emitting carbon emissions. And so this is another very important piece of the puzzle for why we want to make that change or accelerate the change to electric mobility. So with that, I'm very pleased to share this report with everybody, and thanks for joining, and I'll hand it over to Stan Cross.
Thanks, Steve. And hello, everybody. I'm Stan Cross. I direct our electric transportation work here at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and it's an honor to be with you all today, and thank you for making the time. You can go ahead to the next slide, Heather. So I want to first lay out the agenda for our presentation today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what transportation fuel spending is, and I'll help operationally define what we're talking about to sort of level set and provide some context. And then Heather will take over as the prime researcher and writer of this report to go through the method and assumptions, the sort of state and regional results, and then we'll go into sort of a discussion period of sort of the impacts that we're seeing and happily take your questions. And Maggie, who directs our utility reform work, will join. She was also a part of writing this report. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So to help us kind of ground around what we're talking about with retained fuel spending, as Steve said, we've been looking at the various economic development benefits that are here in the Southeast to take advantage of as we switch to electrification. Along with this report, SACE also just yesterday released our second annual Transportation Electrification in the Southeast report, which goes deep into a number of different indicators that we're tracking, including manufacturing investment and jobs here in the region. And what we're seeing is significant growth in both those sectors. The Southeast has a commanding lead on the amount of manufacturing investment that's come to the region, 37% of the national total, as well as the number of EV jobs in the region, 18% of the national total. And so we understand that there's a lot to gain by making this switch. And as Steve began to allude to, we recognize that that gain goes beyond manufacturing investment and jobs, but also includes money that can be kept in consumers' pockets to circulate through the local economy longer, helping to strengthen those economies. And so when we looked at this idea of retained fuel spending, we started by looking at how much we are spending on gas and diesel in the region. And that $94 billion that Steve quoted is kind of what we're currently spending to move the cars, trucks, and buses that are on the road here in the Southeast. And because there's very little oil production or refining in the states that we explore here in the Southeast, the majority, about 2/3 of that 94 billion or 64 billion, leaves the region. It's a leak of money that, as we buy gas and diesel, goes to the states and nations that we import that gas and diesel to. So we retain only about 1/3 of the money that we spend on gas and diesel. What we recognize when we dove into the research that Heather will unpack is that when we switch to electricity, two things happen. The first is that to do the same amount of work, moving people, goods, and services in cars, trucks, and buses on electricity, costs significantly less. For $52 million, we can do the same amount of work, $52 billion a year, we can do the same amount of work with electricity that we're currently doing with gas and diesel. So that creates about a $42 billion savings in fuel expenses annually. And what's also interesting is because that electricity is much more local in its production and distribution and transmission, significant amount of money is retained, 5 billion more than is retained when we buy gas and diesel. So when you combine the consumer savings and fleet savings of 42 billion on expenses with the additional 5 billion retained, we wind up unearthing a $47 billion potential boost to the regional economy. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And from our perspective, understanding this retained fuel spending potential is really important as policymakers and regulators kind of weigh the costs and benefits of transitioning to electric mobility. There are certainly costs that are being incurred currently. Utilities are investing, state government is funding, federal government set to fund to support this transition along with private sector investment. But the benefits of this transition need to be also fully understood. And this retained fuel spending is a key part of those benefits. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Heather and she'll take us into the details.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stan, for teeing that up, and hello to everyone joining today. I'm going to move along to the next slide. So as Stan mentioned, my name is Heather Ponin. I'm SACE's Energy Policy Manager, and I'm the primary researcher for this project. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the core of this paper, which is focusing on this concept of retained fuel spending. And that required us to do some pretty interesting thought exercise on the different types of energy markets and the costs that go into supplying that energy to meet transportation needs. And so I'm going to briefly go over our thinking and methodology on that here before going into the results. So in terms of data and assumptions, a lot of what went into this analysis comes from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is a federal agency that provides a lot of detailed data and information about energy markets in the United States. And one piece of research that really helped inform our thinking on this project was regarding the components of the retail prices of different types of energy. So using gas as an example, this basically amounted to a breakdown of what you pay at the pump. And so that's summarized over in this table to the right. And for the sake of simplicity, this is showing the national average that you can see on EIA's website for each energy type. But this analysis that we're going to talk about does rely on state level data that we obtain through EIA's state energy data system. So starting with motor fuel, we looked at both gas and diesel. We started with how much was spent. We started by calculating how much was spent on gas and diesel in each state. Of course, part of that is looking at the crude oil production that's available through SEDS for each state. We use the price of gas and diesel as well as the gasoline consumed by the transportation sector. As well as for diesel, we looked specifically at the sales of distillate fuel by end use, so that way we could separate out just the on-highway portion. And so to determine how much money was retained in a given state, we broke out a few components of the retail price using these approximations from EIA, and in particular, the distribution and marketing costs associated with operating retail gas stations, and also the federal and state taxes. Obviously, federal does not remain local in the state, but those were kind of the two pieces that we separated out for most of this analysis. Okay, and then the other piece, the other fuel type that we looked at was electricity. And so in order to kind of examine this as the counterfactual, we basically took the gallons of fuel that was consumed in the gas and diesel section and tried to figure out the vehicle efficiency of who was driving those miles. So we basically looked at the vehicle stock that currently exists in each state. Oak Ridge National Laboratory has a survey that breaks down the range of vehicle types and fuel efficiency types. And we use that to calculate a stock weighted miles per gallon average for each state. From there, we used a conversion of 4 miles per kilowatt hour for light duty gasoline vehicles and about 2 miles per hour for medium and heavy duty diesel vehicles. So once we had that total electricity load calculated that would be needed to meet transportation needs for each state, that's when we moved over to this chart and applied these different components of the retail price of electricity. So the EIA breakdown that we initially referenced for electricity goes into just generation, distribution, and transmission. However, SACE put additional thought into that generation piece, and that was a little bit more involved just because SACE does have a lot of underlying proprietary research and data on utility cost models, as well as calculating the unit level costs associated with each unit in the Southeast generation fleet. And so we wanted to put that to good use. And in order to do that, we subdivided the generation costs into the 3 additional subcomponents that you see here. So O&M, operations and maintenance, that does include both fixed and variable O&M, purchase power generation costs, and fuel costs. And so we chose those to reflect the typically occurring annual costs for the power supply in the Southeast. And then one of the final steps for the electricity piece was to apply a retail sales tax to electricity. So for each state, we have a combined average of the state and local tax rate that's applied to electricity bills. And in addition to that, we do have kind of a stand-in for the fuel tax that is typically applied to gas and diesel sales. So it's basically equivalent to the gas and diesel portion. The assumption there is that whatever policies that are put into place for EVs to ensure long-term roadway funding are going to be pretty similar in status quo to the amount that's currently being produced by internal combustion vehicles. Okay. So if you have additional information requests or you want to learn more about the nuts and bolts of this methodology, I highly encourage you to check out the paper itself, as well as there is a specific appendix for the methods that has a lot more detail and information there. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at the results of our analysis. There's going to be a lot of text and numbers over the next few slides, so let me just give an overview before I unpack all that. And this is going to be reiterating some of the stuff that Stan teased out earlier. But essentially, there are about $94 billion spent at the pump on gas and diesel to meet the transportation needs of the Southeast. And the Southeast is comprised of all the states that you see here on this chart and on the map in the previous few slides. However, due to a lot of the factors that I mentioned previously, only 1/3 of what is retained, only 1/3 of those expenditures are retained in the state where the fuel is purchased as a regional average. So you can see on the chart to the left that some states are higher and others are lower. So I'm going to talk about the components of the cost of what you pay at the pump using examples from the states that are listed here. So starting off, crude oil and refining are a big part of what makes up the cost of gas and diesel. And they're also a big part of why these expenditures aren't being retained in the region. Just because there's very little in-region production of crude oil used to produce these fuel types. So Mississippi, I believe, is one of the only states that had any measurable, like significant crude oil production. There is also some refining activity as well. However, even so, I should note that not all crude oil is used for motor fuels. I think it's about 70% of crude oil production actually ends up being converted into a motor gas product. And so that is pretty high, but even for states where there's production, there's not necessarily a guarantee that it is going to be used for on-highway transportation. We assumed for this analysis that it would be, so I think that that's a somewhat generous to the traditional internal combustion vehicle part of this analysis. And another piece of context regarding the role of crude oil is that the market for this is a lot more internationally driven than some of the other energy markets that the Southeast and the US participates in. So if oil is produced in a certain country, it's not always going to be consumed in that country as well. If someone across the world is willing to pay more for it, then it's going to be sold there. So motor fuel prices, tend to be driven by international oil pricing and trades, which creates a volatile market when compared to the commodity markets that electricity fuels depend on. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's most of what's leaving. The part that we do see remain in each state, it's really made up of two main pieces. One is the distribution and marketing costs that are associated with operating retail gas stations, which we assume to remain all in state. And then the second piece of what's keeping gas and diesel expenditures in state is state tax revenues. So here I'm going to call out Florida and North Carolina in particular. You can kind of see that those two states are pretty high as well. And that's in part because they have higher fuel tax rates. And so, those fuel tax revenues are an issue that comes up in a lot of transportation related analysis. And our analysis isn't necessarily forward-looking in the sense that we're trying to predict the future of what's going to be happening there. But again, that is just an issue that you see pop up a lot because of things like rising fuel efficiency standards for gas vehicles and things like idling reduction technology, or idling policies that target the medium and heavy duty diesel users are having a noticeable impact on the amount of revenue that's being collected due to less fuel being consumed. Okay, so even though they make up a relatively large portion of what's being retained in our example year, that doesn't necessarily reflect what might happen in the future. Okay, so you can take a final look at this table and just kind of keep a few of these top line numbers in mind as we move on to the next slide. So keep that 94 billion spent, and then also that 30 billion that's being kept within the state. And so keep that in mind as we move on to examining the electricity counter example of this analysis. So that 30 billion that was being retained with gas and diesel sounds pretty good at first, but as you can see from this electricity table, that you can see that there are actually more expenditures being retained with electricity, even though consumers are spending far less. So to drive the same number of miles with electricity, it would cost about $52 billion annually, and that's almost half of what we're paying for gas and diesel. So to summarize and reiterate that kind of top line numbers that Stan talked about at the beginning of the presentation, consumers would be spending $42 billion less on electricity for $5 billion more in locally retained dollars. And this averages to be about 2/3 of expenditures being retained in the Southeast, in the state where the electricity is being purchased. Okay. So we're going to take a look at we're going to take a look at the key factors that are influencing electricity prices to understand why states differ from one another. And I'm also going to tease out a little bit how this number can maybe even improve in the future and get closer to 100% local. So for those of you who aren't familiar with electricity infrastructure, kind of a basic rundown is that electricity is first generated at a power plant using fuel. That power travels long distances via transmission lines. Transformers step down that voltage before it's carried to homes via distribution lines that you see in neighborhoods. So I'm going to come back to the generation piece and first just separate out the transmission and distribution, just because these are two components that they're pretty big components in this analysis that are all 100% local for every state. So again, distribution lines are all local because they're power lines that you can see in your neighborhood carrying power to houses. And transmission, on the other hand, since it carries electricity at longer distances, it can sometimes travel out of state. For this analysis, we ended up considering transmission to all be local because even though power can travel across state lines, the portion of power that travels out of state is typically very, very low when compared to a utility's total load. And the utility serving load would likely just be in a neighboring state, so they would not be using very many miles of transmission lines. So it's in a neighboring state rather than traveling through multiple states. And so, any difference that there would be pretty negligible. So that's why 100% is considered to be in state for this analysis. Okay, and moving on to generation costs. This is a little bit more involved and it varies a lot more from state to state, just because we do have that generation fleet kind of underlying data. So for example, using these states, for example, states that meet a lot of their power needs through self-generation see more costs coming from the operations and maintenance of power plants, which is, again, all work that is performed locally. So that fixed and variable O&M, we do consider that to be all local. And the other part that I specifically want to call out from the generation costs is the fuel cost subcomponent. The money that's leaving the state is leaving the state primarily because of fuel costs. The majority of the generation in the Southeast comes from energy sources such as coal, nuclear, and fossil gas. And the primary unconverted energy fuel is coming from other states. Even states with some measurable amount of energy production, such as Alabama and Mississippi, for example, have some coal and gas. When you compare that energy production in the state to what's actually being consumed by the power sector, you can see that state production really is not very much at all, and it's not anywhere near enough to meet their load demands. So that has to come from the rest of the country. So those fuel costs are really a big driver of why this number isn't closer to 100%, for example. Okay, and then finally, just reiterating the other piece of this is the retail tax, the retail sales tax that's applied to electricity sales. That's all retained locally, and also the state and diesel fuel tax stand-in. The state portion of that is retained locally, while obviously the federal portion is not. Okay. Next, I just wanted to emphasize again the scale of these numbers and the portion of expenditures that are being retained by each state. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this is to just reiterate the unnecessary spending that's currently happening from continuing to use gas and diesel for transportation needs. The difference, for example, if you look at Florida, is about $2 billion, but that number is really a lot more significant when you consider how much less is being spent. About $13 billion less is being spent. I also wanted to call out the kind of consumer impact really quickly, because it's costing less for the consumer to travel the same amount of miles, and that's really freeing up a lot of room in household budgets. So one of my favorite pieces of new research that I reference in the paper is a study that's done by Argonne National Laboratory that's looking at the affordability of household fuel costs. And this is separated out by region and state and socioeconomic factors. And so that paper does things like looking at what percent of income is being spent on fuels, on transportation fuel in different states. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting way of putting some of these savings in context. You may have also noticed in the previous charts that states like Florida and North Carolina and even Georgia make up a pretty large portion of the region we're looking at. Those three are at the top of this chart. This chart is actually ordered by the magnitude of expenditures. Obviously, because these states are more on the populous side and there's a lot of cars driving around and therefore consuming that energy. And so electrifying these states has an outsized impact on the regional average for that reason. And there's really, that's kind of, it doubles down because the power supply in these states is expected to get even cleaner in the future. In particular, Florida and North Carolina are kind of becoming regional and even national leaders in solar additions. And so as the region transitions to things like more solar, wind, energy efficiency, and also storage is going to be a big part. The number, the percent that is retained is going to be driven up pretty considerably. So when transitioning to the resources that I just mentioned, electricity prices would end up being composed a lot more of that operations and maintenance, transmission and distribution, which, as I already mentioned, are all local and in-state. So I did also kind of lift up that SACE mapped out the transition to a clean energy future for a couple of the largest utility systems in the Southeast. And in this analysis, we actually do identify a high investment in distributed sources. And so one of the implications, tying those two pieces of research together is that transitioning electric generation to cleaner sources while simultaneously electrifying the transportation sector can further increase the level of consumer spending that's retained within states and also in the region. And so I think that is a pretty good note to end on. Thank you everyone for listening. Our contact information is here, and I think we're going to go to Q&A.
All right, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Stan, and folks. Thanks for putting your questions in the Q&A box. I'll remind you to keep those coming. We will be tracking them and get to as many as we can. I'm Maggie Schober, Director of Utility Reform, and I will be passing off the questions to Heather and Stan to respond during this Q&A portion. All right, so let's start out with, I think you went over this in the presentation, Heather, but maybe it's worth reiterating because we did get a question on it about some of the utility spending on fuel to generate electricity is not retained, but actually is sent out of region, and did we account for that? And then we also got questions about specific fuels that were considered. And so if you can touch on those, they were both biodiesel and compressed natural gas.
Yeah, so just reiterating that you're correct that some of the utility spending on fuel to produce that power is not retained. So all of the spending on nuclear, for example, none of that is retained. And as I mentioned, there is some coal and gas production in the States, but it ends up being closer to zero than 100% being retained, just because it's, as I mentioned, it's not nearly enough as to meet what's being consumed in the state. And I think the other question was about, have we considered biodiesel in the analysis? I don't think we did. I know that the EIA SEDS data, Maggie, that you looked at may have had information on that, but I don't think it was really a significant portion enough to include an analysis. And I believe that's also the case with the compressed natural gas. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct, Heather. They were both just so small, they weren't worth considering in this kind of a study. Can you talk just for a second about the types of electricity fuels or generation types that do retain in region? So what kinds of, you mentioned most gas and coal and nuclear fuel spending all go out of region, but what types would keep the spending in the region? If you could touch on those, that'd be great.
I'd say, obviously I mentioned solar in the analysis. We also do consider energy efficiency as a resource because, there are costs associated with running those programs that the utility energy efficiency programs do pay for and do have value as a generation resource. Currently, there's not a lot of in-region wind, but that, that could change. Storage, I also obviously mentioned. What else? There is a little bit of biomass in, not a lot in the region, but I think there is some specifically in Georgia, and I assume that to be retained within the region, but I don't really see that growing in any significant way.
Great. All right. Thank you, Heather. Okay, we will move over to Stan for one for you. This one is a little bit, it's still related to the topic, but we got an interesting one about electric buses that I'm hoping you can answer for us. The bus transition is very new, but with all the electric bus funding in the bipartisan bill, can you talk about electric school buses a bit and what we should be looking for?
Yeah, it is an exciting time for the medium and heavy duty sectors as the technology to support electrification of buses and trucks starts to come to market at scale. And school buses are a technology that we're seeing move pretty quickly, as are we transit buses. But with the school buses, what's really interesting and something to watch for is that the use case of school buses, right? The fact that they stay idle for many hours a day and for many months a year create the opportunity for those school buses to be used as a grid asset to store electricity in their batteries that can be used to help solve a variety of challenges, including peak demand and making most efficient use of solar generated during the day, as well as providing resilience by potentially being able to act as a generator powering shelters during extreme storm events. So there's a lot of value that may come from those school buses beyond just transporting children to and from school in a sort of more healthy and lower emission way. So I think that's going to be really interesting in terms of how school buses might be integrated as a grid resource and help support the sort of local use of electricity.
Thank you, Stan. All right. Stan, I'm going to keep you on deck. We have one more, switching gears a little bit. Here's one about taxes. So it says, one could argue that gas tax revenues are not really expenditures on the product and shouldn't count. Then you wouldn't have to come up with a stand-in for such taxes on the electricity side, even though most states have done so. What's the argument for counting it?
It's a great question. And, we certainly batted this one around internally, and where we landed is that currently in the electric transportation policy space, across the Southeast and across the country, the question of how you assess a fee to electric vehicles to make sure that EV drivers are paying their fair share for highway expenses is a hot topic and one actively being debated. And so we felt that to exclude acknowledging the fact that there are state taxes garnered on gas and diesel that help support highway funding would sort of make the analysis come into question and would raise the issue of appropriate EV fees in an outsized way for what we're trying to drive home with this report. So by including it, we just take that argument off the table. We're accounting for it. We're recognizing that whatever shakes out in the future, however highway funding ultimately is supported, we all recognize that with cars and trucks getting more efficient, and as Heather said, other technologies like idle reduction and policies to support that are in place, not enough revenue is being collected by states to maintain the highways. And so something needs to change, and that debate is a live wire. But we know that whatever comes, we'll have to make sure that as we drive more electric vehicles, we are maintaining adequate funding for our roadways, without a doubt. And so by including it, we're just acknowledging that, and we're making sure that the analysis doesn't become written off by not having included that.
Maggie, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Switching back over to Heather for the next one. Can you explain a little bit more about how you chose the conversion factors for miles to kilowatt hours in the analysis, please?
Yeah, so we had four miles per kilowatt hour for light duty and gasoline vehicles, and about 2 miles per kilowatt hour for the heavy duty and medium diesel. And so I think it's important to note that these were chosen to reflect a little bit newer technologies. So the idea behind the analysis is looking at what's going to be replacing vehicles currently on the road. So if you're looking at, for example, performance evaluations of existing EV fleets, you'll probably see figures that are a little bit lower than what we used in the analysis. But I think that the idea is we're trying to show what is going to actually realistically be replacing what's on the road today. So that's kind of how we handle that.
It's a great explanation, Heather, and it really aligns with what we found in our transportation electrification report that we released yesterday, and that when we look at the incredible sort of ramp up of EV sales over this last 18-month period, we can expect that by the end of this year, about 50% of all the EVs on the road will have been sold in the last year. And so is with that rapid growth, that sort of newer technology is going to quickly dominate EVs in market. So that's, I think, a really important point to make when we're thinking about these numbers.
Thank you, Heather and Stan. All right, Stan, I think I'm going to see if you can provide some commentary on this one. And it's changing the subject a little bit, but please comment briefly on the change in the parts and maintenance industry with less required for EVs.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want to speculate too much in terms of what the future holds for that operation and maintenance sector. I think what I will say is that SACE is working with other partners to really think through what would be a just transition to electric transportation, and considering not only the impact on folks who currently repair internal combustion engines and maintain internal combustion engines, but also taking into account things like the auto dealership model that relies on profits generated by service centers to really make those businesses and keep those businesses profitable. Also looking at innovations on the assembly line that we're seeing companies like Tesla and Rivian and Arrival implement that may result in reductions of the number of folks needed on the assembly line to get these vehicles off that assembly line. And so when we're looking across this transition, what we believe is important to be considering in all of the policies and regulatory reforms coming is how this transition happens in a just and equitable way. And that includes considering the workers. And we're heartened to see, on the federal level with the Biden administration's recent executive order really kind of setting the course for us to get to 2035, where all new vehicles sold are electric, that the United Auto Workers are behind this move and they're sort of getting behind this transition, which is a really good sign. It doesn't mean that there's not work to do to make sure that just transition gets implemented, but we're seeing that conversation elevated, and I think it's a really important one across the value chain to be considering.
Thank you, Stan. All right, just a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box that we will keep moving through. All right, Heather, you're up next. Does this analysis take into the total cost of ownership? And can you talk a little bit about what this term means, total cost of ownership, when we're talking about vehicles? Thanks.
Yeah, so this analysis is looking at fuel costs only. So even though we know, and it has been proven through other research, that EVs require less maintenance than traditional internal combustion vehicles, just because there's fewer moving parts, so there's fewer things that you need to replace. This is really just looking at the fuel specific costs. I think that if you wanted to look at things like ongoing maintenance of a vehicle, there are some pretty good other pieces of research out there. I know Consumer Reports puts out some good stuff on that subject. And I think Atlas also put out a piece recently that's looking specifically at kind of these more encompassing costs. And they're using the federal vehicle fleet as kind of their unit of analysis. So I think that those, could be good resources to learn more about like what other benefits, financial benefits there are to converting the fleets that, this analysis doesn't even necessarily cover.
And just to add to that, Maggie, one of the intentions of this analysis is to spur further analysis, right? So our excitement about this report is to kind of put out into the ecosystem this line of thinking, with the hope that others who are experts in economics or might be experts in the just transition or other elements of this move to electrification will use this data to go deeper. Because I think there's a lot more to explore here, and by all means, we intend this to be a starting point, not an end point, and look forward to this analysis, evolving over time as others dig in and add to it.
Great, thank you. I always love analysis where one of the findings is we need to research these other 5 questions that came up, which is usually the case. All right, so we have a couple of questions that are not specific about this analysis, but related to EVs kind of more generally. So I think both Stan and Heather, if you guys could weigh in on this. We'll start with Stan. Could you talk about the necessity and progress of building up electric grid infrastructure to support EV charging infrastructure in the Southeast? So how big of a barrier is this, and what's going on with EV make-ready programs? What are those, and how are they evolving in the Southeast?
Well, it's been a really exciting year in the Southeast when it comes to utility engagement and investment. We've seen significant increase just over the last 12 months. We've gone from about $30 million invested in the region in utility transportation electrification to over 130 billion, with another 205 billion pending in a filing in Florida. So there's a lot of movement beginning to take place in this space, and where the focus primarily is in getting fast chargers along highway corridors and evacuation routes to support intra and interstate travel, and make sure that folks can safely evacuate who own EVs in areas that are prone to increasing and stronger storms. And another area of focus is looking to fill the equity gap. So looking at markets where the private sector is currently not deploying charging infrastructure because there may not be a profitable case for them currently, but where it's needed to spur an equitable and accessible market, utilities are stepping in and beginning to install infrastructure there as well. The other thing that we're starting to see, which we've been calling for years, is consideration of different rate designs that can help both spur the growth in the market, as well as set the system up to make most efficient use of this new load that electric vehicles will bring. And so we've seen just recently in North Carolina, a filing that's pending from Duke Energy that's looking to bring a make ready program to market. And what that means is that the utility kind of takes responsibility for laying the pipes and wires. So basically bringing the power to the charging station, which really helps site hosts reduce cost of installing that charging infrastructure by recognizing kind of the future revenue that charging station is going to provide the utility as EV drivers plug in, and providing some of that future revenue as a credit to the site host to help defray installation costs. We're also seeing the beginning of rate designs that are looking to, create different classes of users so that folks can kind of opt into what's typically referred to as an EVSE tariff. EVSE being the technical term for electric vehicle service equipment, also known as a charging station. And those tariffs are looking at how utilities can come in and provide charging stations and the maintenance of those charging stations, which are often a barrier for fleet adoption in particular. In exchange, the fleet operator in this case, would not have to pay for that infrastructure upfront, but would rather pay a monthly fee for the utility to install and maintain that infrastructure over time. And that opens up the opportunity for the utility to be working more collaboratively with those potential large electricity users, particularly freight, school and transit bus, and large light duty fleet users. And by creating that dynamic, it begins to open up the ability for the utility and the fleet operator to work in conjunction to make sure that power is being distributed in an optimal way, both for the fleet's needs, but also for the grid's needs. So I think you're going to see more and more of this conversation elevate as we start to see light duty vehicles at scale and medium and heavy duty deployment starting to really pick up in fleets. So it's going to be really exciting, I think, next 3 years of some of the pilots that are already in place across the region, finally running long enough where we have good usable data to see what's working and what's not working, and then begin to see that implemented in more robust and permanent programs to ensure both needs of drivers are met as well as the grid function is maintained.
Thanks, Dan. All right, I think we have time for one more question. All right, I got another one for you, Stan, if you can stay on the on the hot seat for another minute. Which is a better motivator for EV adoption? Rebates, tax incentives, maybe even something else? Do certain segments of customers benefit more from one versus the other? And how do they impact high income earners compared to low income households for one or the other, or some other kind of incentives?
I always love the bucket of something else. So that's a wonderful bucket for us to consider in perpetuity. But as far as the debate between tax credits and rebates, what's clear is that the way in which electric vehicle tax credits have been structured on the federal level, requires the purchaser of an EV and only qualifies for new EVs, and requires the purchaser of that new EV to use that tax credit that same year. And so it really limits who that tax credits has any worth for. It's really somebody with enough tax liability to use that full credit. So when we look at cash on the hood rebates instead of tax credits, those rebates are more usable by a much wider audience. Basically, everybody can take advantage of a cash on the hood rebate, regardless of their income or tax liability. So SACE certainly favors considering on the hood rebates as opposed to tax credits. When we do look at tax credits, there are opportunities to structure them in ways that are more useful to purchasers, similar to the solar investment tax credit, which if you can't take in the first year, you can keep using in subsequent years to help offset tax liability. So it's a tax credit structure that opens up its worthiness to a larger audience. But still, the rebates, are the way to go if we want to really, help incentivize an equitable transition to electric transportation. And further, not only considering new EVs for those rebates, but also considering used EVs. The used EV market is growing quickly, particularly as early EVs are coming off of lease and EV buyers are purchasing their next longer range EVs. And as that used market grows, it becomes a great target for moderate income folks to get into EV ownership. And a rebate can really help there. So I think we got to pay attention to both the new and used market as a way to get more transportation electrification to happen, and then be able to realize even greater benefits like the ones that this report are pointing to.
Great, thank you, Stan. All right, that concludes our Q&A section. I'm going to pass it over back over to Dory to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you for spending some time with us today. Thank you to everyone who participated, and thanks to our panelists. Please be on the lookout for an email that will provide you with links to the recording of today's webinar, along with a blog post and the report. We will also be sending the complimentary brief Transportation Electrification in the Southeast that was released yesterday by SACE and Atlas Public Policy, which provides an overview and update of the state of technology deployment and investment in manufacturing of EVs in the Southeast. So thanks again, and have a great day, everybody. Take care.